In Mullumbimby, New South Wales, Australia on April 12, 2021, talking to Anna Watts in Byron Bay down the road. And it's we're in the same time zone. That's good. So I've known you for what, 15 years, and yet I think I'm going to get to know you better by probing into your life, who you are and why, and what led you to do the wonderful work that you're doing. So let's start with the circumstances of your birth. I know it was in England, but let's tell the audience all about it.
Thank you, Jack. Yes, so actually my work now totally relates to the circumstances of my birth. So I was born in England. I was born in Nottingham, in Sherwood, not actually in the forest, but in a suburb of Nottingham, Sherwood. And I was born at home. My mother gave birth to me in my grandmother's house. And she was attended by her sister, her mother, her sister, and the community midwife. So this was in the late 50s, 57. And it was in the era of Call the Midwife. So if anyone is familiar with that wonderful television program, yeah, there's a lot of memories that I have when I watch that show, because of course everything on set is very similar to what I grew up with. So that's why I think I enjoy that show so much. And my father at the time was the station master. He was at the beginning of a very long career with British Rail. And as part of that early days of career, they had to do the different roles before they became into management. So he was the station master at Newcastle-under-Lyme in the Pottery area. And so my mother had travelled previously back to her mother's to prepare for the labour. And my dad was on the train travelling to be there while Mum was in labour with me. He actually didn't arrive during the labour. He arrived shortly afterwards. So it was an all-female support team with my mum. And the only thing that I really recall my mum telling me about my own birth, she did share that it took a long time to push you out. And I understand that now to be second stage of labour, my descent through the birth canal. And I was grateful that she never said to me, well, you had a big head, because she was taking some responsibility around the birth experience and how long it took her and I don't know. And, you know, sadly, she's passed away now. So I would have probed in more detail into, well, how long was a long time? Which I didn't do at the time when we talked about my birth. However, what I learned through doing rebirthing, so if you're not familiar with rebirthing, that is a breathwork, a system of breathing where you can go into altered states of reality. And one of those states may be to revisit your own birth experience. And I had the fortune of going back to my own birth the very first time that I did a rebirthing. And what I discovered was that during that time I was in the birth canal, I'd actually gone to sleep. So there was no rush, there was no emergency, there was no, what are we going to do about getting this baby out? All I could understand was that I'd been able to go to sleep while my mother had gathered strength and then ultimately emerge into the world. And I am eternally grateful for that experience of my birth, which was undisturbed. And nowadays, of course, you know, training doulas, working with pregnant families around all the different kinds of intervention that can come into play. I'm even more grateful that I had that experience myself. And it's only through that delving back on a different level into the experience that I became more aware of what had happened, that I'd actually dozed off in that process. And so my father then, you know, came shortly afterwards. So the male energy then entered the space. And from everything I know, that was quite a happy time. And I have some really favorite photographs of my dad bathing me as a baby and holding my hands as I began to learn to walk. So I think those years were really, really happy years, because they had waited to have me until my mum was 32. And even nowadays, we don't think of that as being a mature mother. But in those days, in the 50s, to not have a child if you were married and, you know, not having a child in your 20s was very unusual. And they purposely waited because they were living in lots of small little apartments around London and moving a lot while Dad progressed his career. So they wanted to be a bit more stable. So I guess the station master's house was the stability they wanted. So, and then I came along. Yeah, for just after 4 years later, I then had a sibling, my sister. And that was another interesting birth experience because Mum was diagnosed with placenta previa, and the indication was to have a cesarean birth. And so she was in the hospital being prepped for surgery when my sister emerged naturally vaginally. And so Mum's memory of that, pardon?
She just popped right out? Like
she just popped right out. Yes. And so, you know, Mum's memory of that was getting into trouble for not being in the right delivery room from the midwife, you know, or the nurse on duty, because they thought it was going to be a cesarean and then it wasn't. So, yeah, just interesting that, you know, reflecting back on the births and how our births affect our life as well. And so, of course, that then led me to choose home births myself. When I came to have my own first baby, and I was, guess what, 32. Oh, really? So same age as my mum, following that pattern, but for very different reasons that I delayed, which I might go into later. But yes, at 32, I chose to give birth at home with my first baby. And during the process of that pregnancy, I went to birthing classes with Marie Burrows from Birthing Rights, and Marie's wonderful work of personal exploration and inner growth around pregnancy and preparing for birth just really helped my preparation for that labor and birth. And I continue to draw on the work of Marie even now in my teaching 33 years later.
Well, I want to come back and continue with your work now, but let's spend a little more time with your early childhood memories, how it was with your sister, parents' influence, you know, all the crucial factors that I'm sure also shaped you.
Yes. Interestingly, because I was 4 when my sister was born, I didn't want to have a bar of her. Apparently there are moments of me trying to, you know, tip her out of the pram, and I just wanted to get rid of her. I didn't want the attention that was going to my little sister, who was a very gorgeous baby. However, my mum was advised at the time, however true that was, that she wasn't receiving enough breast milk and that they needed to supplemental feed. And so there was a lot of attention on making sure that my sister got the right nourishment. And as a 4-year-old who'd been the center of attention, I wasn't happy about that one bit. So, however, we went on to become really close friends, and we still are to this day. And down the track, I was to be doula for her for the births of my nieces as well, which is very beautiful.
So were you stayed in the station master's house, or was there a lot of moving around, or what?
Yeah, there was a little more moving around. And then there was one thing that happened shortly after my sister was born. My father's parents, my grandmother, became sick. And so my parents brought our grandparents to live with us. And that was a really strong influence on our childhood, because the dynamic of the household revolved around making sure that grandma and granddad were happy. So there were things that we found it very restrictive. We were limited on how many friends we could have over and how much noise we could make. And I do recall an incident which I later did therapy over, around the fact that we were laughing too much one day and it was too noisy for grandma. So that came up in a therapy session at some time. Yeah, my sister and I enjoy laughing nowadays. Yeah, so that was a very strong influence, having that older generation. And now when I look back, my grandmother was actually younger than I am now, when, she was in her mid to late 50s, when it was deemed that, she probably wouldn't live much longer. And she actually went on to live for another 14 years. So this was all through my childhood years, from being 4 until being 18. So.
Wow.
Yeah, big influence. Something that I consider nowadays, that I'd love to be closer to my daughters, but I certainly wouldn't want to live in the same house. But close by would be beautiful.
And school, what was that like for you?
I was about to say a non-event. I don't have particularly happy memories of school, although there was one thing that made a big change. I'd actually taken, in England in those days, you took what was called an 11 plus exam, and that would define whether you would go to grammar school or to secondary school. And I passed the exam and went into a girls' grammar school, which was located on the same campus, quite a way away, but still the same campus as the boys' grammar. And after 1 year in the all-girls school, the school became comprehensive. So the boys and the girls merged, literally. And it changed everything. The dynamic of the school completely changed, from this emphasis on us learning home economics, how to be good cooks, as good women would learn to become good wives, needlework, all those skills that, kind of in those days were taught to girls. And then suddenly it opened up and we were allowed to do other things, like we could choose to do metalwork if we wanted to, which wasn't on the curriculum at all beforehand. So pretty new era. But of course, for us girls, the exciting thing was to have the boys around. And I think
what year this would have been, like junior high in the States, 7th grade or?
Yes. So this was in probably 8th grade that this happened. And so, yeah, so I would have been about 13, 14. And that was when I first started dating boys, when I was 14. Yeah. So, and we laughed about the fact that we were picked up by the school bus, which was a double-decker bus. And the girls had to sit upstairs and the boys sit downstairs. We weren't allowed to sit in the same seats with the boys. And there was a supervisor on the bus to make sure that we didn't get up to any, monkey business on the bus.
Wow. Huh. Well,
Yes.
How was dating for you at 14?
How was dating?
Yeah.
How was dating? That's a really interesting reflection. I think it was quite tricky, actually. Didn't really know how to act on those days. And a date involved, going out for a walk in nature with a boy. It didn't involve really. I think it was later that perhaps we would have gone to the movies or even to a dance or something like that. But it was more like we'd go out for a walk in nature, and maybe do a bit of kissing. But my mother was very forward in terms of talking about sex in a very matter-of-fact way. And later on, when I did get into a sexual relationship, it was my mum who came with me to go onto the contraceptive pill. So that was all. She was all. And in fact, on one occasion where I thought before I'd gone to the contraceptive pill, where I thought I might be pregnant, my mum had actually gone and got the pregnancy test done for me and came to college to let me know that I wasn't pregnant. Most of my friends were in awe of that my mother would actually, do something like that for me. So, so that was really beautiful to have that support. And interestingly, I'm writing a book at the moment, and I'm just reflecting on the 15 years that I stayed on the contraceptive pill, from being 15 to 30, with no concern, no thought at all about any side effects, or there was really no considerations in that regard. I do remember asking a doctor once, what are the side effects? And he responded saying, well, you tell me if you think you've got any. And then, because if I tell you what they are, you'll probably get them.
Ah.
Interesting response. And so I stayed on the pill for 15 years. Yeah.
Hmm. And I don't think that's that unusual. At least it wasn't in that era.
No, that's right. The pill was, what I'm aware of, it was about women's liberation. We were liberated from not becoming pregnant. There was very little talk about sexually transmitted diseases or anything like that. The whole focus was do not get pregnant. And of course, giving us the freedom to have, sexual relationships.
So any particular topics in school that caught your attention? Did you take metalworking?
I didn't take metalworking, but one of the topics that I loved, which has showed up later in my life, was geography. I took geography instead of history, and I loved learning about new countries and, things happening around the world. And of course, that has shown up later in my my desire, and in fact, the pilgrimage that I took to visit the sacred sites around the world. And the other reason that that's strong is I've got Sagittarius. My moon, astrological moon, is in Sagittarius, which is about travel. So I think that the geography and the travel in my astrology are very strong. So that's why I love being in other countries and learning about different cultures.
Well, we'll get to some of your travels more later on, because I've been on several of them with you.
Yes, you have. You have.
So any other school era things of note? Or?
Well, I left school at 16, and for some reason, no idea why, I decided I'd go and take a course in hotel reception. So I trained for a year as a hotel receptionist. This was in the era of the switchboards with all the multiple cords that you had to plug into all the cords and all that. So I learned how to do that. And I ended up working as a hotel receptionist, I don't know, perhaps only for 6 months or something like that. And then I went to work for an employment agency called Brook Street Bureau. And it was when I was at the employment agency that I saw an ad that said receptionist for an advertising agency. And so I turned to my manager and said, oh, what's an advertising agency? And she said, oh, it's a lot of fun. They drink lots of champagne and, have fun clients, and it's a great time. So based on that, I applied for the job as receptionist at the advertising agency. And some of those things were true, but also very, very long working hours and a lot of stress. And so this was, I think by this time I was about 18. And I had then worked through the advertising, stayed in the advertising world until I emigrated to Australia, and then shortly after that, and became managing director of a large advertising agency in Nottingham, and sat on the board of the the national agency. There was a whole group of agencies throughout the UK. So you could say that in that life, I was more detached from my body than I am now. It was a world of high heels and shoulder pads, and very little connection with the physical body, apart from, of course, sex, because that was part of the advertising world, was the, drinking and dining and, sexuality. But yes, I was very disconnected from my body, with the exception of I went to yoga once a week. And it was not the yoga that I now know. It was more of a exercise-based yoga through the British Wheel of Yoga. But it was something that I really loved. And so later on, before I ended that career, when I came to Australia, I decided to train as a yoga teacher. And that's where the next part of my life began.
Mm.
But yes, all of those years driving around in fast cars and out wining and dining were that other phase of my life.
And it's such a different you than I know. It's hard for me to
Very
imagine.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very,
And,
very different.
before we leave the home situation, anything you want to say about parents, sister? We'll get
Oh,
into.
just one more thing, which I think is interesting about my mum's family. So my mum was one of seven. And so she had three sisters. And there was a lot of connection with women, of course. And because I was in a household of women as well, apart from my dad and my granddad who later died, but there was a lot of connection with women. And so sometimes when I reflect back on how much time I spend with women these days, of course, with my work and running women's circles and trainings to do with women's work, I think, well, those seeds were planted a long time ago, that trust in women and the circle of women.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So how many years were you in advertising in London before, or was it in London or
Nottingham,
in
but I did
Nottingham?
travel
So
to
you stayed
London
there.
quite a lot. I traveled to London quite a lot because I was on the
Mm-hmm.
board there as well. So yes, so that was about 15 years in advertising, all up. And that was how I came to be able to move to Australia.
Mm-hmm. So tell us how that came about.
So that came about in two ways. One was a very magical way, which you know about, which was I had a couple of friends who moved to Australia, and when they left England, I said he was Australian, she was English, and I said, "Oh, okay, so I'll see you for a holiday." And they didn't think at all that I would follow up on that. Australia was quite a long way away in those days, the late 80s. There was a number of stops on the way to get from London to Australia. My niece recently flew back from Europe direct to Darwin on a single flight, which is how it's gone these days.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, you had to stop a couple of times on the way in those days. And but I meant it because I was earning good money. And so came to the Christmas holidays and it was a bit chilly in the UK. And I thought, right, I'm going to go and have this month in Australia. And during that time, they were based in Adelaide. I wanted to visit the centre, and in those days we referred to it as Ayers Rock, but it's now gone back to the traditional owner's name of Uluru, which is much more appropriate. And so I managed to go to Uluru to get a flight from Adelaide. I had wanted to take the train, but the centre of Australia was flooded at the time, so I ended up flying to Uluru, to Alice Springs, and then driving to Uluru. And it was a full moon, and one of those magical moments where I was standing near the waterhole under the rock, looking up at the moon. The moon appeared to be balancing on the rock. And the words, "You have to live here," was so strong. It was almost like the rock was talking to me, or something was talking to me. And I wasn't used to, and in those days, I wasn't used to nature speaking to me. I loved nature, but I wasn't used to really tuning in. And so "you have to live here" was the prompt for me to start exploring. Well, I didn't think for a moment that I was going to live in the desert. However, I did get offered a job when I went back to Alice Springs. A guy who had a small tourist business said to me, "Oh, I haven't got any female drivers. Do you want to come and run tours for me?" Which I declined, but I did think that was a positive sign. And I do remember lying in one of those above ground pools that I'd never seen in England, those pools that sit above the ground. And I was floating in the pool before I left Alice Springs. And I said to myself, if I still feel this way in a year, I will see what I can do about moving. So a year came and went, and my career was taking off in the UK. And it didn't feel like the right timing. But a couple of years later, I came back again to visit the same friends. And this time I was asked by my CEO to visit an agency in Sydney. And through visiting that agency in Sydney, I got offered a job to come and work with them. And they sponsored me to come and relocate to Australia, to Sydney. That was 88.
88. Mm-hmm.
88. Yeah. So my first trip was 83, and then I came back again. And then by the time I had to wait for my visa, and came back in 88. And the visa was delayed for 3 months. I was planning to get here 3 months earlier. And just about on that time period, 3 months earlier, I met the man who was to become my husband and the father of my daughters in England. And so we had 3 months of getting to know each other. And then I left the country without any plans to reconnect. But of course, fate had other plans for us. And he did end up following me, and we married a year later in Australia, in Sydney.
So what was life like in the high speed lanes of advertising in Sydney? Any different?
The truth is, it was chauvinistic.
More so than England?
Very much more so. I was really blown away by, at that time, Australia was quite behind what I was used to. You know, in England, I sat on a board that was equal men and women. In Sydney, the owner of the agency agreed to make me a member of the board, but called me into his office and gave me a sort of a warning or a talking to that I wasn't to upset anybody. And, you know, it was quite unheard of that he was going to put me on the board. And that was the environment that I'd walked into. Creative standards were pretty poor in those days. And I'd come from a really creative, you know, having a great creative team in the UK. And that was one of the things that I loved about working in advertising. Yes, it was a bit cutthroat and it was very competitive, but I really enjoyed, well, the two things were the creative side, and I also enjoyed the training and mentoring of the staff that worked for me, which is something that's kind of followed through now in mentoring doulas. Yes, and so looking back, it was the best thing that could have happened to me to land myself in an environment that I ended up hating. Because in the UK, I probably wouldn't have left the advertising world, or certainly not so quickly. My daughters, when they learned about that previous career of mine, sometimes said to me, "But Mum, you know, you were earning all that money. Why didn't you stay over there and, you know, have all those things?" And I said, "Well, because you wouldn't have had a mother, you would have had a nanny, and it would have been a very different life for you. You know, I wouldn't have been the hands-on mum that I came to be, having left that behind." Yeah. So it took the first year, which was quite a lonely time being in Sydney. I knew no one when I moved to Sydney. I'd only met the son of the owner of the advertising agency who'd recruited me. So yeah, I was completely alone and starting to set up new friendships. However, because I was alone, I had all this time and began to explore the things that I had an interest in. And so one of those was yoga. So I joined a yoga school and started training as a yoga teacher, and also joined a training in spiritual healing, energy healing, because I had always been quite interested in that type of thing, though I didn't practice it in the UK. I didn't know very much about it, but there was an interest there. And the yoga school was very different to the yoga that I had experienced in England. And it was very much more rounded. So it wasn't just the postures, the asanas. It included meditation and yoga nidra, one of my favorite practices, deep relaxation, and kirtan, chanting, singing, things that I still love today. And it's a more of a truer picture of holistic yoga than what I had experienced before.
So you're transitioning out of the high-speed world. These courses got you going, but what was the next step?
Well, the next step was, yes, continuing to feel that I was in the wrong place in the advertising world. And then my husband to be joined me after a year. And we very quickly conceived our daughter before we even had actually married. So she was very keen to come through, I guess, and wanted to be conceived in Australia. So very quickly I was pregnant, and that gave me the reason to pull back, first of all, to pull back to part-time work, and then ultimately to step away from the work in advertising, because, yeah, I wanted to enjoy the pregnancy. And yeah, I really wanted to immerse myself in enjoying that time. And actually, when I finally left, I had, I think I had 12, no, maybe it was 10 weeks that I was going to have before the birth. That Jade arrived 3 weeks, well, not early, but she arrived at the 37-week mark. So I was a bit like, oh, I thought I had 3 more weeks of really enjoying the pregnancy, but that was her gestation time, 37 weeks, and all went really, really well. Yeah.
So I imagine the next few years you were pretty much full-time momming or mumming.
Definitely. Although during my pregnancy, by default, I had become a prenatal yoga teacher. And when I say by default, in those days, there were no approved courses for prenatal yoga. And so I had the good fortune to find the book, I think simply called Prenatal Yoga, by Janine Pavati Baker, the midwife. And that book became my Bible. And at the same time, the teachers, the trainers on my yoga training suddenly said, oh, well, now you can teach the prenatal class. And so my response of, well, I have got no experience. Oh, but you're pregnant, so you're qualified now. You're pregnant to teach the prenatal class. But I'm so grateful for Janine Pavati Baker. And in those days, the work of Janet Velasquez, the Active Birth Centre in London, was also just coming to the fore. So I avidly read her book and brought that as part of my teaching too, and totally loved working with pregnant women. And in those days, the classes were very small. But it was just magical being with those mums and babies in utero in the yoga room. It was really lovely. So I'd already started to teach prenatal yoga and taught, and then halfway through my is that correct? No, sorry, through my pregnancy, I was teaching prenatal yoga, and then shortly after having Jade, I started doing the training as a childbirth educator. And so even though I was a new mum and getting into the mode of being a new mum, I was also training in childbirth education, and then began to teach classes. And 19 months later, our second daughter, Amber, came along. So yes, it was a very busy time. And my husband was incredibly supportive. And particularly because I started being a doula at births. And so in those days, there was not the term doula. We didn't use the term doula. That came in later in Australia. And we were childbirth educators who offered birth support. So we, many of the people whose births I supported were couples who'd done birth classes with me. So often the women would meet me in prenatal yoga. They would decide they wanted their partner to come into the classes as well. So we did the birth classes, and then they would ask me, to be their birth support person. And that's really how it was. And so I was very fortunate to have a husband who would support me. And I also worked quite closely with a home birth midwife in terms of we would support each other with childcare when we did. And we also attended quite a few births together, which was very special. And that was in Sydney, particularly on the northern beaches of Sydney.
I'm just recalling I met Janine first in 2001 in Sydney at a conference at Sydney Uni. So You might have been
So
nearby
I
then.
also met her then. I think it was around that time. Yes, yes. Went to a couple of her presentations and did a workshop with her.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
So you now got two kids, and
Mm-hmm.
you're doing some part-time yoga teaching. What uh, your interest in spiritual and energy healing? When does that kick in?
So that really kicked in big time a bit later. So in terms of healing work, of course, yoga is a healing modality. And yoga nidra, the powerful relaxation technique, has its own way of bringing healing. So I feel like I'd already stepped into that, not as an energy healer, but in offering the modality of yoga therapy in that way. And so when the healing work really kicked off was after I had separated. So 10 years later, after I had separated from the girl's dad and moved out of the city and moved to Bellingen in the mid-north coast of New South Wales, which is an area known for, natural therapies, healing
Mm-hmm.
work, that sort of thing. So I began to then continue to teach birth classes and prenatal yoga, but got more involved in teaching meditation. And in particular, looking at how the chakra system relates to life and how the chakras, the subtle energy bodies that are the chakras, how they affect the way that we live life. And one of the descriptions of the chakras that I like is that they're our libraries of information. So we carry information that we've experienced in our different chakra centers. And so sometimes when an energy healer is working, they will be helping to balance the chakra centers. And that may not even be an actual, I'm going to use the word intervention. It may not be like an intervention. It might be simply bringing the person's awareness to something, and the chakra will start to release something from the past that is no longer needed. So I got very involved in teaching meditation, how the chakras affect our lives, and also training people in spiritual healing.
Mm. So,
Which
now,
I might just add there. And now actually I've also developed a way of looking at how the chakras reflect in birthing. And that's what I'm writing about now.
mm-hmm. Well, and we met about 16 years ago when you bought a house right next to the house that we bought in
Yes.
Mullumbimby. And you were coming from Bellingen then, right?
Yes, no, I'd already been 2 years in the Byron Shire.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'd moved here. My children went through the Steiner education or Waldorf education system. And so in Bellingen, which is a small town, there was no high school offering Steiner-based education. So we'd moved to the Byron Shire where there were a couple of options for that.
Mm-hmm.
We'd found that really helpful, that system of education.
Right, and I've seen that amazing school out in Thora where they would have gone to their first.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, they did, up in the Thora Valley, just outside Bellingen. Very beautiful, magical
and for
school.
Americans viewing this, Steiner education is called Waldorf in the US,
Mm,
so they may
yes.
not make that connection.
Mm, mm.
So you've, any other aspects of your time in Bellingen you want to mention before moving up here?
Well, when I moved to Bellingen, I had a choice. I could have come straight to the Byron Shire then, or to Bellingen. And I made the choice because I had one friend in the Byron Shire and I had two friends in Bellingen. So I made the choice. Made the choice to go with that, and that was the beginning of a new network of friendships, and still have very close friends living there, and got more deeply involved with women's business, I guess, and women's circles, sharing that sort of work. So yes, and a lot of awareness of vibrational medicine. So working with the vibration of the energy body and even creating a range of vibrational essences, like a little bit like homeopathic remedies that related to balancing the chakras. So yes, there was some magical things that occurred in Bellingen, and it is known as a healing valley. And you've been there, it is a very magical place.
Mm-hmm.
But the story of Bellingen is that people would go there and for healing, but then move on. And I felt like after the 5 years there, it was my time to move on. So not only for my daughters to get the next stage of education with the Steiner system, but also for myself, I was ready to come into a slightly more expansive space of the Byron Shire.
So where were you, in Byron proper or Suffolk Park?
In the pocket in Ballynudgel.
Oh, okay.
Which is actually, that is a funny story. So the name Ballynudgel is quite a funny name when you say it, isn't it? Ballynudgel. And
Bimby and
yes, exactly. We have some interesting indigenous names here, don't we? But however, many, many years before, when I think shortly after my husband had moved to Australia, I was with a couple of friends that I knew in Adelaide, and we were saying, where will we live? We had this feeling that we wouldn't stay in Sydney. And we took a pendulum and we took a map of Australia and we ran the pendulum up the side of the east coast of Australia. And the place that the pendulum went crazy was Ballynudgel.
Ah.
And we laughed and said, Ballynudgel, what is that? You know, like just laughed. Anyway, so it must have been 15 years later, when I was moving from Bellingen to Byron, I was finding it hard to find a rental property because by this stage we had a couple of dogs and a horse as well. So it wasn't the easiest thing to rent property with.
Yeah.
And I was feeling deflated because I couldn't find the right place to move to, and bumped into one of my doula clients, a couple whose births I'd supported in Sydney. And they were on their way back to Sydney, having been with their family up in the Byron Shire. And I told her my predicament, and she immediately said, oh, you can rent my grandmother's place in Ballynudgel. So it actually did come back to me. A little bit of synchronicity, and we stayed there for 2 years before we found the place next door to you.
Mm-hmm. So we became neighbors, what, in 2005, and you were doing the essence work then with a partner, and I remember you had a place over in the industrial center. I remember seeing a rather large loft, and tell us a little about that work.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, in Bellingen, with a business partner, I started creating this range of vibrational essences. And we then thought it would be an idea. We had a small healing center in Bellingen, which was very popular. We ran a lot of classes there in meditation and healing work, and some birth classes as well. And so when I moved to Byron, we thought, well, we'll do the same thing. And in those days, the arts and industry estate, as it was known, so an area where either artists or people with industrial businesses gathered, just outside the center of Byron, we went in to set up a healing center. And one of the things that we decided that we wanted to put in the healing center was a meditation pyramid.
Yes.
And we'd heard about this guy who made things from bamboo. So we said, oh, we want a large pyramid, and we want it to the dimensions of the Great Pyramid at Giza. So using the golden mean measurement to create the pyramid. And so he went away and said, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, and we'll create this pyramid for you. And we envisaged that we'd be able to fit maybe 10 people in a circle in this pyramid to meditate and to draw in, you know, the energy through the pyramid structure. Anyway, the pyramid arrived, and it was so low to the ground, you could barely sit under it. It was really low. And we were like, this isn't right. This is not the dimensions of the Great of the Great Pyramid. And it turned out that he'd measured the angle in the wrong angular measurement. So we've got this really low, flat pyramid, when in fact it should be more pointed and tall. And so he had to go away and start again. But it was quite a funny interaction. And we had a laugh about, well, we wondered if we'd had past lives in Egypt with him, where we'd created, you know, temples together or something like that. So we eventually got a meditation pyramid. And because the temple was an industrial unit, it was tall enough to have this tall pyramid. And we had cushions and made it really nice in there. And we had that healing center for a couple of years. And then decided ultimately after that time to not renew the lease, because that area wasn't very popular. There wasn't much through traffic, and you know, it just wasn't a really happening thing. But it had been a beautiful space for us to train some students in spiritual healing, which was really lovely. And after we let that go, another healing center opened opposite where we were. So it felt like someone needed to be there with a healing energy in that environment. And then subsequently that closed and a yoga healing center opened, which I was asked to go and do some space clearing with when they opened. So it's interesting how that area was kind of calling in a healing center while all this industrial and artistic work was going on the outside. That area, as you know now, is so busy and so full of different businesses, entrepreneurs, and, you know, yeah, just mainstream business really working in that area. So we were a few years ahead of our time, I think, in that spot, but it was right for us to move on. And then subsequent to that, I'd always had these two trains running, which were the birth work, the doula work, and the spiritual healing work. And even though they did meet, I had the two sides to the business. And more recently, in the last 5 years, I've really put the focus. Well, actually, no, the doula academy is now 11 years. So it's earlier than that. I've really put the focus into the doula training, but bringing the healing work into the birth training as well. So that's what's happened with that.
And you published a number of things, including the book that I helped edit. And but you started with cards. You want to talk about that?
Yes, back in '99, which is a time before a lot of oracle decks and that sort of thing were around, and there certainly was nothing particularly for pregnancy and birth. So a friend and I, Liz Waters and myself, we came up with the concept, created and produced a set of cards that were for this, taking into account the conception, the different trimesters, the birth and the baby moon phase. And when I use baby moon, I'm talking about the 6 weeks following birth, not the baby moon, which has now become popular as the holiday that you take when you're pregnant. I think it was originally Sheila Kitzinger that coined the term baby moon, meaning the period after birth. And so when I use it in that context. And they were cards of guidance and support for pregnant women and their partners, and offer little healing exercises and ways of communicating, better communication that go along with the cards. And they're called Birthing the Spirit.
Are they still available on your website?
Yeah, they are still available.
I'll put a link for them then. Okay. And then you got into writing a book. And
yes, I actually, before the book, still on the pregnancy and birth, I actually recorded a CD of Yoga Nidra for pregnancy, which is still available nowadays as a download. And for those people that don't know, Yoga Nidra, or also called psychic sleep, is a deep relaxation process. But the way that we relax the different parts of the body, we do it in a certain order that methodically relaxes parts of the brain. So it's actually a really deep process of relaxation. And whilst you're in a relaxed state, it's also an opportunity to release subtle fears. So it's a really beautiful and profound process for pregnancy and preparation for birth. And that's available as a download. And I've more recently recorded one for new mothers, which is around, you know, that sense of I am supported in my mothering, and feeling that you are enough as a new mother. So yeah, that was just on the pregnancy and birth side of things. And then I wrote the book that you edited for me, Jack, which was a book about going to visit the primary 7 sacred sites around the world. And these sacred sites, which relate to chakra points of the earth. So when I talk about the chakra points within the body's energy system, then Mother Earth also has her own chakra points. And some of these are, well, they're all actually at points where what are termed ley lines, or to the Indigenous people of Australia, they're called song lines, or the energy lines that flow through the earth converge at these centers. And so they are, you know, places like Chalice Well in Glastonbury in England, which is known as the Heart Centre. In Australia, Uluru, which is interestingly where I was called to live in Australia, but that's known as the solar plexus of the planet. So the heart of Australia, but the solar plexus of the planet. So yes, I then took me a number of years to get to all those places, and then to finally write the story of visiting all those sacred sites.
Well, just for completeness, why don't you name what the others are for the viewers? And
yes, I will. And so just on that, people often say to me when I talk about, you know, these are chakra points relating to the earth, my reference point was a man called Robert Kuhn, who wrote this book about earth chakras. And also way back when I first came to Australia in '88, I saw a map that he'd come up with, which showed these chakra points of the planet. And people sometimes say, oh, I live in a really strong energy center, it's got to be a chakra point. And what I say to that is, in our body, we have thousands of little chakras. So it's not just 7 or 8 or 9, you know, like, well, there are many chakras, and it's the same with the planet. So I will name the ones that I went to, but for different people, you may relate to different energy centers on the earth. So for me, and the way that I wrote the book was coming from the crown chakra downwards. So the crown chakra was Machu Picchu in Peru, which is a sun temple, so very appropriate for the crown chakra. In the third eye, Varanasi in India, the throat center, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, the heart, the Glastonbury, the Chalice Well in England, the solar plexus, Uluru, center of Australia. The sacral, the womb chakra, is Lake Titicaca on the border of Bolivia and Peru. And the base chakra, Mount Shasta in Northern California, which interestingly was the last one that I went to.
Now, the one in India, say the name again, I didn't get that.
That's Varanasi. And Varanasi is a spiritual city on the banks of the Ganges. And for Hindus, it's the place where they would most like to go in their last days. So that if they had a choice, they would wish to die in Varanasi, because it is said to be very profound on the karma of the soul if you can be cremated in Varanasi on the banks of the Ganges.
So it's like a city, a traditional city, or unusual?
Traditional city, ancient city. And they have ghats of steps that go down to the Ganges. And there are many, Hindus performing puja or cleansing ritual in the Ganges every day, and particular times of the year where the special ceremonies. So it's a very, very beautiful city.
So any other comments on your professional evolution and your work? And then we'll go wrap up with your personal life and your daughters and so forth.
Well, I'd like to reflect on how I went from being a doula, attending many births, to a trainer of doulas, which was more than 20 years after I began. And it was during the time where I was going through menopause. And so when a woman goes through menopause, it is another rite of passage on the feminine path. And one of the things that was arising for me during menopause, along with the letting go of the menstrual cycle, which was something that I didn't feel ready to let go of. And in fact, I didn't actually complete menopause till I was 55, which is reasonably late, because I wasn't ready to let go of it. So I was holding on to it. But during that time, what was arising for me was a lot to do with self-worth. And I understand this from talking with other women in this process of menopause. And so menopause to me is a little bit like the process that happens when we become a new mother. So the part of us that we know before we become a mother is breaking down so that the transformation of being a new mother can occur. And it's a similar thing that happens in menopause. The woman that we know ourselves to be is breaking down so that we can then emerge in a new way. And during that time, I was questioning myself, and I had issues around, well, what do I have to offer? What can I really offer to the world? And, I'm no longer the age of a birthing woman. So have I got anything to offer to the birth world? Perhaps I need to do something entirely different. Perhaps I need to let go of my attachment to birth, because I am so passionate about that and supporting women and families in that rite of passage. But there were a lot of questions for me. And then what started arising was, well, I probably do have some wisdom to share. And it was in that way. It was like, well, perhaps I have got something to share, but I'm not really sure. And it was from that seed of perhaps I've got something to share that the doula training started to emerge. And this idea of wisdom, in the very early trainings that I began with small groups of doulas, the thing that would be fed back to me often was the appreciation of my wisdom. And so what I was questioning was actually being reflected back to me straight away, as soon as I started to share it. And so I like the saying that wisdom is experienced, whereas knowledge is learned. And I do believe this is one of the things that I can offer to doulas, because I have lived that experience of being with women and families in the birthing process, that I can share this with doulas. And up until now, I have trained only in a face-to-face format, because I enjoy being in circle with doulas and training in that way, so that they get the experience of the support of the circle of women while they're learning at the same time. The way things have changed on the planet, there are things that I am offering and will be offering more online, but I'm still really passionate about the circle, learning in the circle format, and the wisdom of the women coming together in the circle to all share what we all bring to the circle, as well as learning the new things about becoming a doula.
Well, that brings your professional life pretty much up to date. Now,
just one more thing on that, though. So for many years, I trained, birth doulas, where the postpartum period was just a couple of visits with clients once we'd supported the birth. And so in the last 3 years, I've been really also focused on postpartum training. So doulas who maybe don't want to attend births, but would like to support new mothers. And I think this is an area that is really growing in our culture because of the lack of support for new mothers. And so, yes, those trainings have been really, really popular, the ones for postpartum care.
And do you want to talk about the ritual that you learned in Mexico?
Yes, so I had the privilege of working with some midwives in Mexico around the ritual of closing the bones. And for me, having attended so many births, this experience of honoring the new mother and bringing her back in both a physical and spiritual, emotional sense to her body was a really profound experience. And for me, it was a missing piece to the puzzle around that, you know, honoring that process of rite of passage through conception, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, acknowledging this is the journey that you've taken, and now we can bring that to a close. And so, yes, in Mexico, they do this a number of times after the birth of a baby. And yeah, I feel very honored that I was participating in that while I was there.
And I know you've done it here or led it, and have you trained other people in how to do it? Or?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yes, the doulas that train with me as postpartum doulas, I incorporate that into that training.
Now, on your personal life, I know your daughters went to the same school as my daughter did, and here in Byron, and then they went off to school in Melbourne, and you've got a very admirable connection with your daughters. I'm constantly impressed with how you describe your visits and how they relate to you. And do you want to say any more about that?
Yes, I am very close with my daughters. We have a really, beautiful connection. One of the sad things about separating a marriage is generally that the children spend more time with one parent. Not always, sometimes it's equal care, shared care. But in my situation, because of leaving the city, the girls spent more time with me than they did with their father. And that felt appropriate at the time, that I was a consistent carer in their life. And what's eventuated from that is a very close relationship, not just with them, because when they were growing up as teenagers, I always had the open house for their friends as well. So I also have good relationships with some of their friends because we spent time together when they were teenagers. They've both gone on to go into caring profession, which is very interesting. One is a counselor and the other one is a social worker. So they've both been through uni, which is something that I never did myself. I trained in other ways in counseling, but didn't go, to uni as a young person. More the training as a mature student. But yeah, it's interesting, and we have fascinating conversations these days. And of course, they can call me on my family patterns, just like I can see what's happening for them, which is kind of cute. So, and yes, I must say that I can feel my grandmother urgency around, the desire to become a grandmother, and all in good timing when they're ready.
When they're 32, of course.
Yeah, Jade is almost 32. So
wow.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah.
Okay, well, any other final words of wisdom as we wrap up?
Well, I'd like to really come back to the women, the women, the birthing mothers, the pregnant and birthing mothers, and the enormous gratitude from what I have learned from them. And not only in my birth work, but in my healing work, I'm always constantly amazed at the way that people navigate life, and the strengths, and the way that the human personality can navigate the challenges of life. And so I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity that I've had to work with so many people. And the doulas, I feel a little bit like a mother hen with the doulas, as they go through their beginning births, and they receive mentoring from me when they're first going to births. So yeah, it feels like it ripples out. It's a little bit like a spider web of ripples that, the doulas out there with the birthing family, but I'm also holding the energy line for them as they support the birthing family. So very, very grateful for that web of life that continues.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Anna, for sharing so much of yourself with us. And I know you're just beginning in many ways. So working on a new book, and
Yes, working on the book that everyone's
fine.
expecting, which is the birthing book this time, not the travel book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you
Thank you,
again.
Jack. My pleasure.